there is no illusion that companies in the Global South are all operating as fairly and ethically as they could be and should be. So a conversation like this around these regulations has to have exactly that effect, to hold all companies to account and say, no, these are important social, environmental and governance standards.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the FSR Policy Briefcase with me, James Kneebone.
And me, Leonardo Meeus.
Today we're very lucky to be joined by Mira Tiwari, who is a researcher at the Robert Schuman Centre, and she also collaborates with us here at the Florence School of Regulation. Mira's work covers many things, including social and environmental justice, public perception of climate policy, and the governance of sustainable development, all of which converge nicely in the topic for today, which is the Global South implications of the EU's environmental, social and governance frameworks, or ESG, i.e. the standards measuring a business's impact on society, we can say. So it's about transparency, it's about accountability, and I think Leo and I are going to be learning a lot today. So thanks very much for joining us, Mira.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. So Mira, you published an article. Normally to get on this show you have to publish a policy brief, but because it's you we made an exception, right? James overruled in a sense. But it's actually already written a bit like a brief, right? Because it's an academic article, but you go straight to the point because you have 6 nice reform suggestions basically, and we'll talk about that today. As James said, it's all about ESG, so one of these acronyms again. It's about how that impacts the Global South. Very interesting. And what are some of these reforms you talk about? Well, there are different perspectives we could take. We could talk about the development of that regulation, to what extent Global South was involved, how it affects them, how the reporting can be more streamlined or not, digitized, whether it's broad enough in terms of accounting, whether we need another framework for ethical investment, and whether we need to work on public literacy related to this topic. So, you had an article, that was the occasion, but then also the policy development went into your direction because we have an EU omnibus on sustainability reporting. So perfect timing to talk with you, even though that's true that omnibus is a bit focused on making European companies more competitive again, but then again, who is in the value chain of many of those companies? The Global South, which is what you are talking about in the article. Yeah. And we have a few questions for you, and James will kick it off.
So I wondered if maybe the best place we can start is really by defining this term Global South, because it's a new term to this podcast, and also the Global North, because I think it's the relationship between the two and somewhat seemingly sort of unidirectional relationship as regards ESG that prompted you and your co-authors to write about this. So perhaps we could start with those definitions and why you wanted to write this article.
Yeah, gladly. I think the novelty of the term is precisely what's telling. It's precisely what is unsaid and unspoken when you're building a regulation and you're talking about how you want to be a leader in global policy. You can't do that if you're not looking globally. The terms Global South and Global North have a lot of history. So, you've got roots at their very origins in primitive versus developed, third world equivalences. You have a transition into them starting to be a bit more political, sort of post-Cold War. What's the geopolitical situation between different countries? How are we relating to each other? Going a bit more into the socioeconomic differences between states. And now we have a bit more nuance that also recognizes that you have elements of these Global South marginalized characteristics that exist in the Global North, and you have elements of Global North centrality and privilege that exist in the Global South. You can conversely talk about the minority and the majority world, but that puts a bit more of an emphasis on the population scale. In terms of where we were going with these recommendations, we were also looking at who are some of the discourse setters in ESG regulation, and those discourse setters exist in all countries. So that Global South and North allows you that nuance to talk about what are different trajectories going on and who's governing and who's governed. And the reason why it's important for us to be talking about that is really to pick up on that privilege. If you have the privilege to be setting a narrative and setting a framework, there are serious domino effects on other countries. And there needs to be space to be considering the long-term global positive shifts that you can be affecting in these regulations in a way that means that it works together and doesn't just create more problems down the line than you expected because you were looking only inwards.
Okay, perfect. No, I think that's a really useful place to start. And perhaps to get onto more familiar ground for us, you have 6 policy recommendations, essentially, which we're very familiar with here on the show. I wondered if you could perhaps, just pick out a couple of those. Of course, we'd encourage our listeners to go and read the article in full. It is a really interesting read. But perhaps you could highlight a couple of those that you think were the most important and why.
Yeah. Picking up, I think, on where we left off in the last answer was our first recommendation, which is really that developing regulations has to be collaborative, first and foremost. It's not setting a regulation and complying. It's setting a regulation together because everyone is involved in that compliance, and it's a collaborative, collective compliance. There have been, at a global level, in terms of climate negotiations, greater calls for challenging the limited set of perspectives that are defining the narrative in climate regulation and climate agreements. We're seeing that at COP, and we're seeing that in calls for greater involvement at a global level. That's not happening so explicitly in the corporate sector and in the regulatory sector, even though in those sectors the implications are very, very, very concrete and very immediate. And it really isn't, the important element here is it's not a question of doing a favor or of it being, representation. It really is at an entirely practical level, the agency of other actors that already exists. So not necessarily about giving agency, but it exists. Actors are doing a lot in terms of the regulation and the management of a sustainable transition. That needs to be there in the development of these regulations to make sure that when it has a knock-on effect down the policy line, they already function together. Yeah. And it also has to do with a set of perspectives that can challenge an assumption, at the core that might not necessarily work. In the case of the CSRD, this is especially important because for the first time, the regulation is mandating, now we'll maybe discuss a bit of the changes later, but it's mandating accounting all the way down your value chain. So if you are mandating that accounting all the way down your value chain and your raw materials or your initial production is happening in a country several hundred kilometers away, you need to know what is the regulatory landscape several hundred kilometers away. What kind of data can they access? What is the infrastructure to get that reporting up? And if tomorrow you impose that regulation, is that company able to be part of that reporting process? And if not, what happens? What we're seeing in practice in certain sectors is kind of what people feared would happen, is that investors just leave. They say, well, this is really too complicated. We're not going to be able to account for all of this. So, sorry, we're out and we're going to onshore all of our production. Now, at an EU competitiveness level, maybe that's what comes out as a positive outcome, and it is a positive outcome in some senses. But there's also really interesting literature on what it gets called in-miserizing growth, or boom and bust, where you go in and you invest because it's profitable. The day you have to account for your entire value chain and you can't do that, you leave. And you leave that entire infrastructure of industries behind. We're seeing that happening in renewable energy, which is very much a problem, because if you want to be a leader in climate policy and you want to be a leader in a sustainable transition, the irony of leading that and as a consequence of your regulations, divesting from the context where you were investing in renewable energy where it's needed, the irony is quite blatant, but those two conversations are happening very separately. I think a second very important recommendation, and that is kind of what operationalizes this idea of collaborating, is the need for data. Data is this unspoken world, especially if you work in the social sciences. It's very easy to spend your entire career working on the conceptualization of what's a fair policy and leaving the data to the statisticians. And the statisticians work on how we harmonize data and all the methodologies, and need not, at their basis, have those conversations about what's correct data and what's just data. doing away with that division as early on as possible and working together to understand what is your data infrastructure, because the regulation and the reporting doesn't exist without that data, and then the compliance doesn't exist, and then meeting your targets doesn't exist. Yeah. Are you looking at qualitative data that is more flexible? Are you looking at quantitative data that's more harmonizable? And if you need to go down, as was the case with the CSRD, to companies that are even smaller than 1,000 employees, do they have the capacity to give you that information on their entire value chain? In order to do that, there are recommendations at the EU level for a sort of European single access point, where for customers and investors, you'd have environmental risk data, publicly available, easily harmonized, easy to access. But this goes back to our first point. It's not only European companies who are involved. The particularity of this new regulation is it applies also to non-EU companies, not only down the value chain, but also non-EU companies that have a large presence in the EU. So a European single data access point doesn't solve your problem of accounting for your entire production line. For that, you do really need a much more structural system of governments and statistical agencies and businesses working together to build a harmonized system all the way through that says we can trace this data and we can make it accessible publicly so that they can hold us to account. You can't greenwash your report if everyone can see the same database.
Yeah, so it feels like maybe the regulation goes a little bit in advance of the infrastructure to deliver on it.
Yeah.
In reality, right?
Yeah.
Which, I don't know, to me, to a complete non-expert just listening to you, it seems a little bit sad or a little bit perverse, because presumably some of the logic in the ESG is to provide, better working conditions or protect local environments where products are made. But the sort of negative externality can be in, what might be well-intentioned efforts to achieve those things. You end up excluding those parts of the value chain entirely. They cannot participate anymore because, as you say, the infrastructure potentially doesn't exist to implement the obligations of the regulation. So the investors rather divest and onshore and do it somewhere else. And as a result, those participants in the global south are just excluded rather than being included under better conditions.
It's an excellent point, and that is exactly what's needed. There is no illusion that companies in the global south are all operating as fairly and ethically as they could be and should be. So a conversation like this around these regulations has to have exactly that effect, to hold all companies to account and say, no, these are important social, environmental and governance standards. The fact is that conversation has to happen. And at the current situation, if it's not happening, as you said, it's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, rather than saying we're having a messy conversation because we know there will be industry lobby. If that conversation happens, there's likely to be industry lobby from a global south context pushing back on the regulation because they too don't necessarily want to comply with improving the standards of their businesses. But there has to be the conversation to hold them to account, and has to be the conversation in which there's space for a company that does want to comply to remain part of the system.
And how could we do that conversation? Because you already said it has to be more collaborative. Yeah. In the EU, when we develop new rules and regulations, we do some things like public consultations. Is that the solution also here, to have more global south participation in a consultation? Or what other ways could we have to achieve this?
Yeah, there are a couple of really, I think, interesting examples that come up in how one might respond to this. The first is very much participation in the regulatory bodies. If you look at a global level, the ISSB or the GRI, which are the two sort of international standard setters, or two of the big international standard setters for ESG regulations, and you look at the composition of their board. In the ISSB, there is one member from Africa, from the entire continent, 4 members from Asia and Oceania, but they are all East Asian. So there's no one in South Asia, and we know that the supply chains of much of what we consume in the global north comes also from South Asia. 4 from the Americas, and they're all from North America, so it's a bit of a fallacy to call it the Americas. And 4 from the EU, which population-wise and production-wise doesn't hold up. The same is for the GRI. They're all global north, 1 person from Nigeria and 1 person from China. Going back to what we said at the beginning, it's not a tokenism or a favor or representation. It's to say, we need to make these regulations work. We need, or we should want, someone on our board who knows the context where we're working and can give us insight and give us access to that knowledge so that we can make it functional. Otherwise, we're caught doing what they're having to do now, but with the omnibus revision of having to backtrack because they realize it didn't work. The second that's a bit more interesting and quite nascent, and I'm interested to see where it goes, is a bit of a diverse form of diplomacy. A sort of networked diplomacy where you're getting business actors and government actors working much more closely than before. So in the Indian context, over the past year or 2 years, they established the Federation of European Businesses in India. And that is an institutionalized set of business actors that come together, represent themselves, but because of the scale of the businesses that are coming together, they are very, very closely working with the ministries in India and in the EU. And it's this interesting overlay. They had meetings recently with the European ambassador in India and vice versa. It's this blurring grey lines between what we would have thought of as traditional diplomacy and the regulators sitting in another room and the business actors. It's probably what happens a lot in terms of FSR's work, where you've got that blurring space. We see that a lot at FSR within the EU, but bodies like this are coming out and doing it transboundary. And there is the space that you can be having the conversations to say, okay, what's the business landscape like here in India? India's goods exports to the EU are somewhere around 60 billion euros annually. And the EU is India's second largest trading partner in terms of exports. They sit down and talk about, right, we have massive business interests here. What does your production landscape look like? What are your interests? And how do we build this regulation in a way that tomorrow, when it comes into force, we don't have to pull out rapidly because we panic? And that's a very interesting space of building these regulations more ethically and more sustainably.
Okay, very interesting.
So the penalties are quite strict then for non-compliance. It's really a case of shutting things down. This is not voluntary compliance. It's really really strongly enforced.
Yes and no. There are, that's messy. So there are elements of voluntary compliance, elements of it being mandatory. Right now, in a bit of the revisions, there's pushes for more of it to be voluntary than mandatory, especially going down your value chain. So whereas the initial regulations that came out in 24 and 25 said, no, report down your value chain, there's currently pushback for that to be restricted up into only companies that are greater than 1,000 employees or with a certain turnover, something around 50 million euros. So there you're cutting out a little bit of the mandatory element. So the consequences are currently a little bit up in the air.
Okay, no, that makes sense, yeah. So, we're the Florence School of Regulation, so we talk a lot about regulation. That makes sense, and we have to this point. But I'm also interested in the business case, because I guess in an ideal world, the most profitable businesses are the ones that are ESG compliant, and those two go together. And you have market forces, therefore, creating positive outcomes and pushing things in the right direction. From the research that you present in the paper, it seems quite inconclusive that there is this, sort of positive relationship between ESG compliance and better outcomes for businesses. And I wondered if you could discuss what some of the reasons are, maybe for the differing experiences of companies, because clearly some are making it work at a business case, and ultimately why it remains contentious.
Yeah, it would be ideal if there was this nice correlation. And the absence of that correlation is exactly why we're seeing pushback and why it's so complicated. There's one very important distinction between your compliance and your actual actions. So, and in both of these channels, we have differing findings. Down the compliance side, the question is always the extent to which consumers and investors value your compliance. And by that, they mean the quality of your reporting, the transparency of your reporting, and also what you do within that reporting. the findings tend to be quite mixed. On the one hand, in certain sectors with certain types of consumers, we see that consumers really value this. There is an uptake in people going and searching for sustainable products, whatever that label might mean. And that takes you in the direction of, right, it's great to be ethical. You might see that down certain investments. So I, as an individual, if I go to my bank and I want to ask them for an investment portfolio, I, as a young person in 2025, will ask them for an ethical investment portfolio. And signals like that start suggesting that this is beneficial for a company. At an investor side, compliance is not actually making that great a difference. There have been surveys of large global investors that, while they state on paper that they're very much in favor of ESG principles, the actual cut they're willing to take to their returns is nothing better than 1%, in favor of greater ESG outcomes. So in practice, they're not willing to see that shift happen. So that sends a massive signal. And then, of course, there's the separate world of investments, and that's a whole second set of regulations, which is a little bit of a subset of these, but how you regulate financial institutions and their portfolios, but it falls into that same family. But the question of, are you willing to take a cut to your returns in favor of better ESG outcomes, brings you into the second channel of what impact do your actions have. If you have to be ready to take a cut to your returns in favor of certain ESG outcomes, that implies that pursuing certain ESG outcomes means taking a cut to your revenue. Now that's the second question, because certain companies will say, okay, we're willing to take that cut because in the long run, we're going to make it back. Other companies that are smaller say, I can't afford to take that cut. If that's going to mean that I have to spend more either on a better quality of materials or on better regulation, I have to take longer to produce what I do, or banally, going back to our data question, you cannot underestimate the amount of time and money and energy it takes for a company to report on these things. I mean, you know it in academic projects, how long it takes to report on what you've done, and we are a small ecosystem doing things and we're in charge of what we do, let alone reporting on an entire value chain of production. That is a margin of expense that companies don't always have. And if they can't guarantee that that's going to get them greater returns in the short run, that becomes a big space for pushback, and that's where we're seeing some of these changes in the omnibus. We did have certain recommendations on financial institutions taking greater responsibility in this. So financial institutions have the economic margin, they have the privileged position in terms of data access and in terms of power they can wield discursively and access to certain conversations. And they have the privileged position in terms of the resources they can move to shift more into giving very clear signals that certain compliance and action has positive impacts for the financial conditions that they offer to businesses and to customers. That could be a space where they can also start bridging investors who are interested in more ethical practices and companies that wouldn't otherwise have been known. And the financial institution, rather than being a tick box exercise, can say, we really become the custodians of this data in a way to use it and be that bridge. But again, as we were talking with the other recommendations, it requires a structural rethink of how you operate and what's your responsibility.
Okay. I'll ask about the omnibus, because we sort of mentioned it at the beginning to say your topic is really high on the agenda today with a focus on European competitiveness. So this omnibus was announced in the headlines to reduce compliance costs for European companies by 40 billion by exempting 80% of companies, mainly smaller companies. This proposal was made after you published the article, but we have you here, so maybe we can ask you, what do you think about this omnibus?
Yeah, the omnibus has opened up a bit of a Pandora's box that we were hoping to skirt around in our article, because we have two recommendations that really come at the crux of the negotiations that they're undergoing right now. And one really was to streamline the reporting requirements for SMEs, for small and medium enterprises, because there is a massive backlash against that burden that we just referred to. But the other was to mandate and make much more central the accounting for Scope 3 emissions, so emissions that are outside of any assets immediately owned and controlled by the company. And obviously these two elements are things that we've been discussing all the way through. How do you account for your entire value chain? Reconciling those two is precisely the challenge that they're facing right now. They're right in the middle of it. So the decisions so far have been, there's a stop the clock directive to just put everything on pause and delay the year by which different companies have to start complying. So at least giving companies a bit more time to understand how it works. But there have also been decisions, as you said, Leo, to exempt swathes of companies from compliance. Those swathes of companies would be the spaces in which you're starting to get Scope 3 emissions and where you're starting to get that ethics, as we said, going all the way down your value chain. The challenge is that by some estimates from the Commission, SMEs account for just over 60% of the EU's corporate emissions. And that's just the EU. That's before we're even accounting for embedded emissions. So there has also been a formal complaint by a few NGOs, large NGOs in the EU, against this shift with the omnibus revision, saying that this is unethical compared to the targets of the EU Green Deal. They challenge the push that they see coming from a small group of industry, saying, yes, you want to simplify, but have you really thought about whether this is consistent with our targets as the EU? Have you thought about whether this is ethical as a direction to be taking? The problem with that formal complaint is it doesn't really have any, binding outcomes. So it will be taken into account, but the pressure that's coming out will be quite strong. There is relief in terms of how it might benefit the smaller companies trickling down. So if we go back not only to the EU context, but globally, and if we said at the beginning, this could have massive boom or bust implications for the global south, creating this, I think what they call this sort of value chain cap, the point at which we stop requiring certain levels of accounting, that can help prevent that boom or bust, because they say we can keep this value chain because we report up to here and the rest is okay. But the ethics still do come in. Are we still accounting all the way down? The streamlining question, it's like when a student asks to make their exam easier. You can make it easier by cutting out all the hard questions, or you can make it easier by asking the questions better, harmonizing them, better, creating the teaching all the way through that makes the exam make sense all the way at the end of the year. When we talked about simplifying reporting, we didn't see that as mutually exclusive with bringing in Scope 3 emissions. We said, no, you need to have templates that make sense across the different standards. You need to have data that's accessible to everyone so people are not spending hours of their lives every week trying to figure out how to report on this. Rigor and streamlined rigor require much more structural work to align than just making the reporting process easier. And that's the negotiation that regulators are now, unfortunately, finding themselves, and I don't envy them at all, having to go through. The ECB has said that it's very important to be lowering the administrative burden especially on smaller companies, but has also warned that these exemptions are risking cutting out massive amounts of emissions accounting that does go contrary to the overarching goal under the Green Deal.
Yeah.
Not an easy topic.
No, I don't want to be in their place.
No, not at all. No, I have to say this has really been a steep learning curve, I think, to try and get a grasp on it, because it seems extremely complex and a classic example of one of those issues in regulation that intuitively, when the reform comes and you hear about easing burdens and reducing this kind of obligations, blah blah blah, it sounds kind of intuitively positive and beneficial. and perhaps for some stakeholders it will be, and even perhaps for some stakeholders in the global south, maybe even some companies have reduced burden and therefore they're able to continue to participate, but it's easy to lose sight of the reasons why those policies exist in the first place. So actually maybe the actual employees of those companies or the local environment in which those companies operate do not benefit from it, and that actually this is a process that's been going on for many years to try and get closer to better standards across a full value chain. And perhaps by changing direction, by throwing out some of the regulations and practices, there's a risk of, as you say, sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And the way it's done now has its limits, has its problems, and certainly has its blind spots, but it shows at least a clear direction of travel. And it seems from what you say, these concerns raised by NGOs, that by trying to address this one problem of regulatory burden and bring back this 40 billion euros, etc., we'll actually lose the chance to hit the Green Deal targets, or on a more granular level, improve the lives of people working in the value chains that are important to us here in Europe. So I don't know, I think we need another episode maybe, or
but we identified a few easy fixes as well, right? The composition of that board, for instance, of these international organizations. I mean,
yes,
that's a clear one to fix.
I mean, the best place to start, of course, is with the article and the 6 recommendations. So I encourage all the listeners to take a look at that. I've really enjoyed learning about the subject, and I think you express it extremely eloquently, and it's a really difficult topic to get your head around, but I think you've helped me at least considerably to understand it better. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions.
We know you watch, many of you, but some of you also subscribe? That would be really nice. And that was it. So hope to see you next time.